being needed is not the same thing as being valued. And being useful is not the same thing as being held. Have you ever wondered why you feel a lack of connection? Even when you're in a room full of people that are like-minded, that have similar interests, those are the type of people that I want to be around because you feel satiated. And the sad part is that this is unfortunately happening far and few between now. So many people are surrounded by a lot of people, but are still feeling profoundly lonely. Most of the relationships, they never move beyond the surface. We curated this Pinterest, aesthetically, especially for older millennials, this idea of being polite and everything's wonderful. We're just keeping it at like what I like to call the frosting of the cupcake. We're never getting into the actual cupcake. I see this especially among changemakers. I consider mothers to be changemakers. I consider that peer of yours at work who's always checking in to make sure like, hey, how can I help you? How can I support you? Is there something that you need? To me, anyone who is giving more of themselves to create a better community, to create a better world. But rarely do these change makers give permission to receive. Just because your friend is resilient and just because that friend that you see is independent and they're always high functioning and they have everything together and they're strong doesn't mean that they don't need your support or help. Taking care of yourself is not selfish or excessive, but it's necessary. Welcome to Solo Reframes. These episodes are going to be reflective, solo conversations where I explore the intersection of self-trust, human connection, and the experiences that quietly shape who we become in relationship with ourselves, our community, and our greater purpose. In these episodes, I'm not here to give advice or tell you what to think, but I am here to name patterns, ask better questions, and offer reframes that help us relate to ourselves and each other with a lot more clarity and a lot more depth. I'll be using insights from my own life, things that are happening on our day-to-day, and anything that I might want to dive deeper into from the Wednesday guest interview episodes that we have on Reframing Perspectives. So consider this space a pause, a moment to look again. So let's go ahead and start reframing. Have you ever wondered why you feel a lack of connection? Even when you're in a room full of people that are like-minded, that have similar interests, that maybe you even grew up with, that were your college friends. We all have those groups where we can say that we have a lot of people in our life. We can say that, we have our communities, whether you're a parent and you have your kids' soccer team friends, but there's a lack of intimacy that happens. And a lot of people are feeling this. We see this with the loneliness epidemic and with the waves of people craving connections right now. We have this idea of community in the abstract concept because we may know a lot of people. And so the problem with that though is there depth in those? And the kind of depth where you're actually feeling really fulfilled, you feel cared for, and that where you're not having to show up and perform. We all know that, right? Where you're having to say oh yeah, so this is how life is going so well and everything's so wonderful. And it's but is it though? Can we have that pause and say oh God, things are tough right now? Where the depth of those communities where, when you have that feeling where the conversations linger and they bring a smile to your face, well after those conversations are gone, a week later, you're still laughing about that type of depth, right? Where you're talking about the feeling that you're left with for days or even weeks after, and you can't wait to be oh man, I want to go back to that, that room again. I want to go back to that space again. Those are the type of people that I want to be around because you feel satiated. And the sad part is that this is unfortunately happening far and few between now. So many people are surrounded by a lot of people, but are still feeling profoundly lonely because most of the relationships, they never move beyond the surface. We curated this Pinterest, aesthetically, especially for older millennials, this idea of being polite and everything's wonderful and look at how my life is so picture perfect. And it stays functional and contained. And over time, that depth of connection ends up starving us because we don't have it, because we curated such an experience. We curated a space that was so well performed that now we just are enabling that. We're just keeping it at what I like to call the frosting of the cupcake. We're never getting into the actual cupcake, right? And so there's there's a lot of starvation of that feeling about, how do I form relationships that are truly connected? And I do believe that the pendulum is thankfully swinging the other direction. That because we are craving that deep human connection, if we think about how many of us spend time on social media and we are seeing our friends' photos on their travel trips and we're commenting on them and we're engaging with them, but we're thinking like that is the level of engagement. But now we're seeing a lot of people going the other way, where they're wanting to go in person, connecting with people, meeting at, bookstores. Bookstores are becoming popular again. Walking clubs are becoming popular again because people are craving that in-person connection where they can go deeper. And we're done with this like fickle, it served us for a time, but we see that as people are turning more into longer podcast episodes because they're craving to know something beyond a clickbait, right? We're reading long form content again. Substack is like really popular. And I see this especially among changemakers, that when I describe who changemakers to me are people that are across industries, right? They're people who are deeply purpose-driven, people who carry a responsibility, a vision, and care for others, who are constantly holding space. They're listening to everybody, they're advocating for people, and they're creating impact. And to be honest, a changemaker to me isn't necessarily someone who's, they are creating impact for a better world for our neighbors and for everyone to live in. But these changemakers, I consider to be even just our everyday neighbors, right? Like I consider mothers to be changemakers. I consider that peer of yours at work who's always checking in to make sure like, hey, how can I help you? How can I support you? Is there something that you need? The one who's rallying behind everybody else. Like to me, anyone who is giving more of themselves to create a better community, to create a better world, to create a society that we can feel that we want to actually participate and live in, to me, that is someone who is a change maker for social good. It can be at the home level, in the community level, or the largest system level. And these change makers are people who are going to constantly advocate for you. They're going to show up. They're going to be around you all the time. But rarely do these change makers give permission to receive, right? Like you'll never see that person who's always giving, giving, giving. Rarely are they invited into a space where emotional depth is cultivated for them to lean into, right? They are usually the ones that are driving the community. They're usually the ones that are driving the organization of like bringing people together. And rarely are they the ones that are sitting back and being invited to as a participant. And sometimes I think that we really take change makers for granted. We've all experienced and we've all heard that saying of just because your friend is resilient and just because that friend that you see is independent and they're always high functioning and they have everything together and they're strong doesn't mean that they don't need your support or help. Oftentimes, they've learned to not ask for it. They've learned to not actually show up and ask for that help. It's hard for them. So it's no different with your friends who are change makers, who are just out there always doing something for everybody else. And those change makers who are nonprofit founders, working in public policy, at a philanthropic foundation, doctors and social workers, right? I think of entrepreneurs who are in the intersection of like social impact and tech or education, founders. The list goes on, to be honest, of how you could think about what describes them. And rarely is there a space for them to lean into because we take them for granted. We think like, oh, they've got it. They're good. And so I think about this and I think about like, if they're told that there's a time for you to also indulge in connection and that taking care of yourself is not selfish or excessive, but it's necessary. The people who give a lot have a hard time resting. And we all know that. In fact, I heard just the other day from a change maker that I was talking to who said, you know what? I needed permission to remember that even though I have deep purpose and I care so deeply about helping others, like I go to sleep thinking about it, I wake up thinking about it, that it is more than okay for me to indulge into enjoying the nicer things for myself. It is okay for me to slow down and for someone to ask me, how are you? And that I don't always have to have myself put together in order to take care of others, but it's okay for me to actually allow myself to be taken care of, for allowing myself to be supported. And I forget that. I forget that that's okay. And when I hear that and I think about that, because having been someone that was a former clinical therapist therapist, worked in nonprofit settings where even till today, I do consider myself one of these change makers. And maybe that's why I'm talking about it in the way that I am, because I get this. I'm always thinking about community and connection and organizing and, how can I bring people together and how's everyone feeling about things, being the hostess, right? And it can be sometimes very hard to ask for support and ask for help. And so when I heard this person talking about like, oh yeah, I forgot that it's okay for me to stop and pause and ask, like, it's just a reminder that we're all busy in our lives and we forget sometimes that to really cultivate these deeper, more meaningful relationships, it goes further than being able to say, hey, how are you? Oh, I'm good. Okay, great. Let's talk about whatever else. It's being able to pause and say, hey, like, I remember that you were kind of feeling a little concerned about this. How can I support you? I noticed and observed that even though you were showing up and you were at that party with me, but I noticed that you were taking a lot of breaks. Like, are you taking care of yourself? Have you given yourself a day off? Are you going on vacation? Should we plan a vacation? I know you keep saying you're going to go on one, but you never do. Should we go somewhere together? How can I show up for my friends? How can I show up for my family in a way that allows them to know that it's okay? When I hear that, all I could think about is that's not okay. We need to do something intentionally, something deeper, something that slows us down, something that just pauses, that allows us to feel comfortable with asking for support, for being in community with each other, that doesn't require the change maker and doesn't require the person who's always giving to be the organizer. And I thought about how this is so important for us to give that spaciousness to change makers and to everyone, every person in the community who's just doing so much, and to be able to enjoy that quality time so that you actually have the space to build and nurture those relationships. And I think that's one thing that people tend to forget, that it takes time. Any relationship that is built very quickly and is trying to move through a checklist, that's not a relationship. That's you trying to work through a project deadline. But a relationship is something that takes time. It's building trust. It's getting to know the nuances of the person. It's getting to know how you can support them. What is your energy around that? And when we cultivate those kind of deep relationships that I think everybody is craving right now, it actually allows us to work a lot more in happier, and it gives us more energy, because we as humans are social creatures. And for each one of us and each one of these change makers, for them to be able to see themselves as human beyond the impact work that they do, I think it's so critical. We've designed a culture where we define our identity through our work. And so a lot of times we connect based off of what we do at work. But this really stayed with me. And I thought a lot about how and where is the place where change makers, where people who are constantly giving to society have permission to show up, to be human, and to feel deeply seen beyond who they are at work and who they are in the impact space and who they are for their everyday life when they're waking up and they're thinking about the impact they can make and they're going to sleep with this. So over the past couple of years, I started hosting these Changemaker dinners for this exact reason. The concept to bring 8 to 10 change makers together for an intimate conversation. But there's 2 rules that I applied that was consistent through every dinner that I held. And that was rule number 1, no egos, no titles. You show me ego, I'll show you the door. Thankfully, we haven't had to do that with anyone just yet. The second rule is you're not allowed to ask, what do you do for work? And you can't share what you do for work. And oh my gosh, you could only imagine people who are so purpose-driven, how hard that was for them. The dinners have become a big success, but at first, these change makers really struggled. They're so used to hiding behind their work identity because they really feel passionate about what they do, but they didn't know how to not bring it up. But as the evening would go on, and I curate this in a very, very intentional design in the way I ask questions, in the way that I navigate them, that by the end, when we got to the dessert, and I call us the reveal, where everyone reveals what they do, people forgot what they did. They're like, wait, what is it? Because they forgot their elevator pitch. They're like, oh my gosh, I forgot what I had to even say. And they had allowed themselves to just show up as a human being. They allowed themselves to show up as that sister, as that brother, as that parent, as that immigrant, as that neighborhood friend. And so over the past 2 years, I've been doing this, and that led me to officially launching the Empathy Storytelling Salon, which is an underground social experience for change makers who know that relationships are where transformations happen, who feel intellectually satiated, and where their emotional well-being is supported. And that third part became so important and so something that just felt really critical to make sure that I had part of this launch and part of the salon that I'm curating. So I hosted the official launch quietly in Chicago on January 10th with about 20 incredible changemakers. People who flew in from Costa Rica, from New York, from DC, from Memphis, from LA, who drove in from Indiana, from Wisconsin, of course, Chicago itself. And these are people who are nonprofit founders. They work in public policy. They're psychologists. They work in corporate. They're doctors. They're lawyers. They're human rights lawyers. They're entrepreneurs that are in the tech space. They're entrepreneurs that are in the education space. They are just a breadth of diverse, community organizers working in book publishing, just a very deep, diverse variety of people that care about social good and really showed up. And I was definitely taken aback by seeing how many people came and showed up. But the reason that this happened, the launch, where everyone showed up to this without fully knowing what they were about to experience. And so the space where the changemakers could really step out of performance and really step into presence. And I curated this so intentionally. Everything from the way that the invitation was written to them to the request of how they dress, celebrating themselves, dressing in cocktail attire that also where they can feel connected to their identity or their ethnicity or whatever speaks to them, for them to show up fully into who they are, for them to be able to be present, that from the moment they walk in the room, these conversations weren't rushed, that the stories didn't need to be impressive. And you felt it in the room. You felt it in the vibration of everything that was happening. And it was so wild to me because through this intentional curation, which obviously I had an imagination, but I never thought it was going to be the way it did, where everyone in the room was essentially giving each other permission to really be themselves. And people went there. They talked about divorce. They talked about raising kids at different stages of kids' lives and what it's like to be married in that, and estrangement from parents, stepping into new identities, how they saw themselves at one point in life and how they're feeling a little bit foreign still as they're stepping into this new uncomfortable space of like they're excited about it, but they haven't fully like embodied it. People who are celebrating some special moments that are happening in their life. They really went there. They fully embraced these conversations. Conversations that typically when you put changemakers in a room together, they're going to talk about work. They're going to talk about what's happening in the social space. They're going to talk about the environment, our political system, everything. But this was about them. And so it was a space for them to be vulnerable. And I couldn't even imagine how much that they opened up. And all it did for me was it validated something really special. It validated that something that I think has been easily forgotten in this fast-paced, work-addicted world that we live in. I think what I realized was that when people are allowed to slow down, when people are allowed to just like take each other in, when they're allowed to just pause and not have to show up to impress each other, then you create space for honesty. You create space for intimacy. And it doesn't need to be forced. It just emerges naturally. People were just naturally vulnerable. People who typically take time to open up were vulnerable. And the conversations that went there, like I mentioned, they spoke about things like the quiet grief of loving family members who couldn't meet them with where they are emotionally. Others spoke about becoming parents themselves and the complexity of the pride and fear and the responsibility that comes with shaping another. We talked about the pride and how you want your kids to be proud of you and what that even means. What does it mean to be proud of? What is, how do we define compliments that actually stay with you because it's not how you see yourself? I mean, these conversations that people are craving, and it's because people want to be real. And I think that's what we're seeing more and more is that people want to be real with each other. And when you give the right spaces and you create those spaces for people to be real with each other, they're going to take it. It's hard for people to initiate it, but when you do, they'll show up. The thing is that nobody was asked to be vulnerable and no one was put on display. They could share as much or as little as they wanted. But what was really clear to me and was so evident is that the environment simply communicated. You don't have to try here. And that I felt like, I was just amazed and so proud of these changemakers who trusted that the salon is truly the space where they could meet themselves and they could meet others who welcome them, even if they're meeting them for the first time, but there's a warmth in the room that was felt from the first second, even on a very cold day in January in Chicago. And after this evening, there was a flood of messages that I was getting. I had one nonprofit founder share with me afterwards that, Payal, as soon as I sat in the car, I cried from the love and gratitude in the room. And it was so emotionally overwhelming for me. I was taken aback because this also came from a man, a male nonprofit founder who said that they got in the car and they cried. And there were multiple other men who were in that room who had tears. And it wasn't from necessarily a conversation. It wasn't that they were getting emotionally triggered. That was not what was happening. But the theme and the response I was getting was that I'm feeling emotionally overwhelmed by the love. And the reaction that I got from that text message that I got the next day, that wasn't about the event. It wasn't about the salon. It was about what their body finally experienced. Being seen, being appreciated, and being held without expectations. There was no expectation on the other side of them having to perform, them having to show up in a certain way that they didn't want to. This was truly a space that I created and have been creating that is to celebrate the people that are constantly the ones who are showing up for everybody else. And that was important for each person to experience. And so the way that I curate my salon is with that intention. It's with, how is this name card? How is this plate? How is this food? How is this going to show them that you matter, that your experience matters? Forget about the salon for a second and what I'm designing and building for Changemakers. But think about the parties that you throw. Think about the events that you put on. How much of that is where you're aesthetically putting things together to make it look pretty versus adding depth to it so that when someone is looking at it, they're not looking at it from a place of, oh, wow, this is Instagrammable, but they're looking at it from a place of, I matter. I clearly understood that I really mattered in that room. And so in order for us to develop and go back to deepening those relationships, when we curate those spaces and create those environments that allow people to feel seen and to allow people to feel like I belong here, that's when you open the door for vulnerable depth, for intimacy, relationship intimacy. And that's what Changemakers or any of us truly deserve. And I really, really believe this. You know, I had another Changemaker who's an entrepreneur in the education tech space. And it was so lovely. They said that I don't think I've ever felt so valued or appreciated. It was this odd feeling of, oh, wait, I do matter. And again, it's that same thing. That sentence reveals so much to me because being needed is not the same thing as being valued. And being useful is not the same thing as being held. And so when we can really look at those individuals that do so much for us and we can curate a space where it's like, no, you don't have to show up. We don't need anything from you. This is for you. We're so used to being needed and being productive, but we rarely stop to being held. And maybe because when we pause, we're afraid of what we may face. Maybe the emotions of being held feels too emotionally overwhelming. So it's easier to be distracted. But many change makers and many people who are constantly giving, move through the world feeling like essentially that they're an essential part of the society because of what they provide, what they give, what they add value to, how they, are up here to do something, but not necessarily feel emotionally nourished. I had another change maker from this evening, someone who worked in healthcare, say to me that I felt emotionally overwhelmed by the kindness in the room and how safe I felt to open up. And to me, when someone is using that word safe, right? Safety like that doesn't come from the credentials or the familiarity or the titles or the reputation of this person's accolades. To me, it comes from that intentional relational design and how you intentionally embrace and meet each other and meet each person with kindness and openness and warmth. And by making sure that care is woven into the experience, that from every single, the words you use, the way that they're welcomed at the door, the way that they're carried through the evening, every intention of the action, that each part of that has a lot of care woven into it and that it doesn't get slapped on top afterwards. And the cultural shift that I'm actively working on to shift towards is that we need to stop treating depth, beauty, and emotional nourishment as indulgences. And we need to stop treating them as something that's a nice to have, that change makers have to justify. I think that, there's still a stigma that says that if you're doing meaningful work and if you're showing up, that you should be able to sacrifice yourself. yourself endlessly, infinitely, right? I see this with people that are in social impact work. I see this with social services. I mean, let's be real. We see this with mothers. Mothers are endlessly sacrificing themselves constantly, and who I consider to be the ultimate VIP change makers. And they think often, right, that rest is optional, that pleasure is excessive. Oh, I'll get to that later, but rarely is later ever coming. And so I fundamentally disagree, and I want to spoil every person who puts their heart and soul into making our world safer, into making our communities more welcoming, into making our homes feel kinder and emotionally safe and emotionally regulated. Changemakers deserve rooms that pour into them, and they deserve to have spaces that replenish their soul. They deserve to have relationships that aren't just one-sided where they're showing up and giving and being the one that's needed, but they're also being reciprocated with that same level of care and love and compassion. Because if we want relationship intimacy to really deepen, we've got to really look at how much are we putting care back into the initial ingredients? How much are we putting intentionality? How much are we including pause? These are the ingredients that I would say that cultivate a truly meaningful intimacy, richness of relationships. And if we want to see more of those types of relationships show up in our society, to show up in our world, then we need to show up in that way with that energy that it requires to put into, and that we don't see it necessarily as a reward, but we see it more as a fuel. That in order for us to have a society that is functioning, for us to have a society that is not as divisive as it's been, for us to have a society where we find common ground, we need to indulge and indulgently give to each other and show up. And I believe that when people experience that kind of connection, relationships can truly change, and we create spaces where we find more common ground. You know, where I do believe that through relationship intimacy and by showing up in ways where curating experiences so people can feel safe, that's where we find that healing happening. And this is what, honestly, the salon is. This is why I launched the salon, the Storyteller Salon, specifically for Changemakers. But I think of the salon as a playbook of what can happen across, whether it's a party at home, whether it's your neighborhood block party, but creating that embodied connection that reminds people who they are beyond what they do. Because when we can create that, then we get to know the complexities of each other, and we get to know the richness of and context to behind someone and who they are and what makes them who they are. And it makes us want to invest in those people more. You know, I had people saying, like, by the end that, Payal, I didn't even care what they did. I was so just happy to be in the room with these people that I love the stories I was hearing. I didn't even realize that I would feel so connected to this person by the end of the night. I thought I would totally not have connected with them at all. But the amount of people that they were inspired by and, you know, telling me that, you know, I'm going to build this connection with them, that's where that relationship and trust builds into something even deeper. And in fact, it's only been 2, maybe 3 weeks now since the salon launch. And I've already heard of 12 new relationships being built for collaborations, for partnerships, for engagements, and some purely for friendships. And I think that that's right there is the powerful part, is that we focus so much on the surface layer of how we need to show up, thinking that, like, okay, this is going to get me to that next opportunity. But people invest in people that they truly admire, that they feel confident about, that they trust, that they can see, they see the potential in, that they want to champion. And that happens when we create relationship intimacy. So I'll leave you with this one thing. I want to know from you, where in your life are your relationships staying surface because depth feels risky or indulgent? And what might shift if you allowed yourself to indulge in connection that actually nourishes you, holds you, and creates that emotional well-being? So that, my friends, is today's Solo Reframe. Thank you for being on this journey with me as we explore how to find more depth, connection, and feeling more emotionally satiated. We really need it in our world more than ever right now. I'm excited to have the Empathy Storyteller Salon specifically for Changemakers to have that space, but I really hope through me sharing the Empathy Storyteller Salon story and by talking about it more and more as I'm going to be doing this year, year and hosting more experiences for Changemakers, that it opens a door for you to think about, how am I creating these kind of spaces in my environment? How am I creating these, and how can I participate in these kinds of experiences so that we go back to having more relationship intimacy that honestly is only going to create more emotional regulation, more emotional safety. So with that, have a lovely weekend, my friends, and I'll see you on Wednesday for our next guest episode, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks for our next solo episode. Thanks, everyone.